Maximinus Thrax stands as one of the most remarkable figures in the long line of Roman emperors, not only for the brief and turbulent period of his reign, but also for the extraordinary nature of his rise to power. His rule from 235 to 238 CE marks the beginning of one of the most chaotic and unstable periods in Roman history, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire was shaken to its core by civil wars, invasions, plagues. Maximinus, a man of humble origins and gigantic physical stature, a model that relied not on noble birth or senatorial lineage, but on sheer military strength and the loyalty of the legions. The first emperor who was not even of Roman or Italian descent, he was the very image of the tough and capable commander they wanted. His life, his rise, and the early days of his reign reveal a dramatic transformation in the nature of Roman imperial power. To understand Maximinus Thrax, one must first appreciate the circumstances that made his rise possible. The Severan dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Septimius Severus seized power in 193 CE. It produced strong rulers like Septimius himself, but he lacked the charisma and military credibility that the legions demanded. His campaigns against the Persians in the east and the Germanic tribes in the north revealed his cautious nature. And when he tried to negotiate with enemies rather than fight, his soldiers turned on him. In March of 235 CE, while stationed on the Rhine frontier, it was in this moment of chaos that Maximinus Thrax emerged as emperor. Maximinus was born Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, probably around 173 CE. Unlike most emperors before him, he was not of senatorial rank. Instead, he was of humble, even barbarian origin. Ancient sources suggest that he may have been of mixed Thracian and Gothic blood. His nickname Thrax itself referred to Thrace, underscoring his outsider status. For the Roman elite, this was shocking, almost unthinkable. The emperor was supposed to be a Roman, preferably from Italy, ideally of noble stock. Yet for the soldiers on the frontier, what mattered was not birth but ability, and Maximinus had plenty of that. From an early age, Maximinus distinguished himself by his sheer size and strength. Ancient historians, particularly Herodian and the Historia Augusta, describe him as a man of almost mythical proportions. According to these accounts, he stood over 8 feet tall, a giant among men, with immense muscles and extraordinary endurance. Though these claims are certainly exaggerated, he was probably closer to 7 feet. Still gigantic for his time, they reveal the impression he made on those around him. A living giant who could fight, command, and endure the hardships of military life. Legends even circulated that as a young man he approached the Emperor Septimius Severus during a military review, seeking a chance to prove himself. At first ridiculed, he stunned the troops by displaying his strength and stamina, eventually being admitted into the army. Whether this story is true or not, it reflects the essential narrative of Maximinus's life. The outsider who forced his way into Roman power through physical might and relentless determination. Once in the army, Maximinus rose steadily through the ranks. His gigantic presence on the battlefield inspired awe and fear, and he gained the respect of his men. Over the decades, he served under different emperors, from Septimius Severus to Caracalla and beyond. By the time of Alexander Severus, he was one of the most senior officers in the legions stationed on the Rhine, who saw in him a man who had shared their hardships, marched in the mud with them. The assassination of Alexander Severus provided the opportunity Maximinus needed. When the soldiers mutinied in 235 CE, they immediately looked to him as the man who could lead them. For them, the contrast was stark. Alexander, the bookish, cautious young emperor who preferred diplomacy, versus Maximinus, the towering, battle-hardened general who embodied their values. In the chaos of the mutiny, the soldiers proclaimed Maximinus emperor. He was reluctant at first, perhaps fearing the wrath of the Senate or the dangers of rebellion, but the support of the army was overwhelming. With this act, the nature of the Roman Principate shifted decisively. No longer was the emperor primarily a figure of aristocratic legitimacy. Now he was, above all, the commander of the army, the first soldier among soldiers. Maximinus was the first true Barracks emperor, and his rise marked the beginning of a century in which military power, not senatorial tradition, determined who wore the crown. The Senate, still clinging to its traditions, was appalled that a man of such humble and barbarian origins had become emperor. They saw him as a usurper who had bypassed the proper order. For the people of Rome, he was a curiosity, a giant who had come out of the frontier to rule. Some hoped his military background would bring victories. Others feared his brutality and lack of refinement. Maximinus himself was well aware of the fragility of his position. He knew he had the army's backing, but he also knew that the Senate and the aristocracy despised him. He made it clear that his reign would be built on the support of the soldiers, not the goodwill of the Senate. This was a double-edged sword. It guaranteed him immediate strength, but it also meant that if the army ever turned against him, the first year of his reign was marked by vigorous military activity. Maximinus set out to prove himself as a conqueror, and to demonstrate to both his men and his enemies that Rome had a strong leader once again. The Germanic tribes along the Rhine, who had been emboldened by Alexander Severus's cautious diplomacy, Maximinus personally led campaigns against them, destroying villages, capturing prisoners. For the soldiers, this was exactly what they wanted: a leader who fought alongside them, endured their hardships, and brought them victory. His popularity among the legions soared. To fund his military campaigns and the increased pay for his soldiers, he had to raise taxes and confiscate wealth. This placed enormous burdens on the provinces, especially in Africa and the East, where landowners in cities resented the heavy demands. Grew even more resentful as he drained resources from the aristocracy to feed the army. Maximinus became increasingly isolated, ruling from the frontier with the soldiers, rarely visiting Rome, and leaving the governance of the capital to administrators. To the senators, this was proof that he was nothing more than a military despot, a barbarian commander in emperor's clothing. The early reign of Maximinus thus reveals the key dynamics of his rule: immense strength, military success, and soldierly loyalty on one side. He embodied both the potential and the dangers of the new model of soldier emperors. But it had also pushed the empire further into the dangerous cycle of military coups and civil wars that would dominate the 3rd century. The story of Maximinus Thrax is not just the story of one emperor, it is the story of a turning point in Roman history. With him, the empire entered an age when emperors would rise and fall at the whim of the legions, when civil wars would erupt every few years. Part 1 of his tale shows how a man from the edge of the empire, as the old order of senatorial aristocracy, gave way to the raw force of the military. Maximinus Thrax's reign entered its 2nd phase with growing tensions between his military-driven rule and the increasingly hostile political and social landscape of the Roman Empire. And in examining this period, it becomes clear that while he possessed unmatched physical strength, courage, and a determination to secure Rome's borders, his inability to balance military necessity with political diplomacy and economic stability began to unravel the foundations of his authority. Having secured the throne through the loyalty of the legions and the violent overthrow of Severus Alexander, Maximinus devoted himself entirely to proving his worth as emperor by campaigning ceaselessly along the northern frontiers. He personally led his soldiers into battle against the Germanic tribes, often being seen in the thick of combat, striking fear into the enemy and earning admiration from the men under his command. Ancient sources describe him as relentless in his campaigns, marching tirelessly through difficult terrain, enduring the same hardships as his men, and demonstrating the physical stamina that had allowed him to rise from a Thracian shepherd to emperor of Rome. Yet his commitment to the army, while admirable in the eyes of the legions, came at enormous cost to the wider empire. To sustain military campaigns and keep soldiers loyal, Maximinus was forced to increase their pay, which required massive sums of money that could only be extracted through oppressive taxation. Wealthy landowners and aristocrats found themselves subject to confiscations and levies that stripped them of their property, and resentment against the emperor spread like wildfire among the senatorial class. The Senate had never accepted Maximinus as a legitimate emperor, viewing him as a crude barbarian who had seized power by brute force rather than noble lineage or political consensus. And now, with their estates under threat, they despised him with even greater intensity. Unlike emperors of the past, who had sought at least to maintain some semblance of cooperation with the Senate, Maximinus openly disregarded and even humiliated them, refusing to engage with their council and relying instead on military officers for advice and governance. This deliberate sidelining of the Senate widened the rift between emperor and aristocracy, creating a climate of mutual suspicion and hostility that would prove fatal to his rule. At the same time, the ordinary people of Rome and the provinces suffered as well. With the emperor absent from the capital, immersed in endless frontier campaigns, there was little attention paid to civic administration, public works, or the distribution of resources. For the urban population of Rome, Maximinus was a distant figure, more legend than leader, whose reputation for harshness and taxation overshadowed any sense of paternal care or civic duty. He projected himself through coinage and statues as a figure of immense strength, with a rugged jaw and stern expression. But this imagery inspired fear more than loyalty. Unlike emperors who had cultivated public favor through games, festivals, or largesse, Maximinus offered nothing but the relentless grind of taxation and military expenditure. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated further when revolts broke out in Africa in 238 CE, sparked by the oppressive financial demands of his administration. Local elites, outraged at the confiscations and levies imposed by imperial officials, rose in defiance and declared their own leaders as emperors, rejecting Maximinus's authority. The Senate, long searching for an opportunity to rid themselves of a ruler they hated, quickly aligned with the African rebels and formally declared Maximinus an enemy of the state. This act of defiance transformed the simmering resentment into outright civil war. Upon hearing of the Senate's betrayal, Maximinus gathered his forces and began a march toward Italy, determined to crush the opposition with the same brute force that had carried him to power. His strategy was simple and consistent with his worldview. Victory in battle would secure legitimacy, while defeat would mean ruin. Yet the campaign into Italy exposed the weaknesses of his rule. The march itself was grueling, with supplies running low and morale among his troops beginning to falter. Unlike wars against foreign enemies, this was a campaign against fellow Romans, and many soldiers felt uneasy about fighting against their own people for the sake of a ruler who was increasingly unpopular. As Maximinus's army advanced, they laid siege to the city of Aquileia, a stronghold loyal to the Senate. The citizens of Aquileia mounted a fierce defense, refusing to surrender despite the emperor's overwhelming military presence. Maximinus ordered repeated assaults, but the city held firm, and his forces suffered from hunger, disease, and exhaustion as the siege dragged on. Meanwhile, propaganda from the Senate painted Maximinus as a monstrous tyrant, a barbarian unworthy of the imperial office, and this message began to infiltrate the ranks of his own army. Soldiers who had once admired his strength now questioned his judgment, his leadership, and the endless hardships he demanded of them. The very qualities that had elevated him, his reliance on brute force, his disdain for political compromise, his identification with the army above all else, now worked against him. The longer the siege continued, the more his authority eroded, until finally his own troops, disillusioned and weary, turned against him. In the spring of 238 CE, Maximinus and his son were assassinated by soldiers within their own camp, their heads sent to Rome as proof of their deaths and as trophies for the Senate. Thus ended the reign of Maximinus Thrax, a rule that had lasted barely 3 years, yet left a lasting imprint on the trajectory of Roman history. His rise and fall symbolized the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, a period when the empire would be plagued by constant civil wars, usurpations, economic collapse, and external invasions. Maximinus demonstrated that military power alone could seize the throne, but his fate showed that it could not guarantee stability without legitimacy, political skill, and the support of Rome's governing institutions. He remains remembered as the giant emperor, a man of immense physical strength and courage who embodied the virtues of the soldier but lacked the wisdom of the statesman, and his downfall illustrates the fragility of imperial power when it rests solely upon the sword. Maximinus Thrax's reign entered its most turbulent phase after the first years of military campaigns. For although he had secured victories against Germanic tribes and projected himself as a soldier emperor, his neglect of civilian politics and his hostility toward the senatorial class began to create deep fractures in the empire. Maximinus had never been comfortable in Rome, and his reputation for physical strength reinforced his image as a leader of soldiers. Yet his absence from the capital allowed resentment to fester, and burdened by the heavy taxes required to finance the emperor's continuous campaigns and the generous donatives he showered upon the legions to maintain their loyalty. In Rome itself, the population saw little of their emperor, and even less of his concern. For Maximinus cared little about games, public works, or the traditional gestures of generosity that kept urban citizens satisfied. This style of rule may have pleased the soldiers, and when combined with his relentless demands for wealth, it produced growing instability. The crisis truly erupted in Africa in 238 CE, pushed beyond their limits by taxation and imperial agents. The proconsul of Africa, resisting the emperor's demands, joined the rebels. The Gordians were not military men of Maximinus's type. They were respected aristocrats, symbols of the old Roman elite, cultured, wealthy, and connected to the Senate. Their rise represented a sharp contrast to the Thracian outsider on the throne. The Senate in Rome, desperate for a chance to rid themselves of Maximinus, in a rare act of defiance, the Senate declared Maximinus an enemy of the state and recognized the Gordians as legitimate emperors. This was a bold and dangerous step. Nevertheless, the Senate was emboldened by hatred of Maximinus and by the hope that the provinces would rally to the Gordians' cause. For a moment, it seemed as though the Senate had struck a decisive blow. In Africa, the governor of Numidia, loyal to Maximinus, led legions against the Gordians. In the ensuing battle, Gordian II was killed, and his aged father Gordian I took his own life in despair. The rebellion in Africa collapsed almost as quickly as it had begun. They had declared themselves against Maximinus, but the Senate did not retreat from its challenge. They moved to secure new leaders. Grandson of Gordian I, as Caesar to appease the Roman populace, who adored the Gordian family. But it placed the Senate on a collision course with Maximinus. When news of the Senate's defiance and the Gordian revolt reached Maximinus in his northern camp, he ordered immediate preparations for a march on Rome. Intent on punishing the Senate and crushing the aristocrats who had dared to oppose him, Maximinus's army, accustomed to the fertile frontiers of the Rhine and Danube. The journey was long and exhausting, supplies were scarce, and the hostility of local populations slowed their progress. The Italian cities, loyal to the Senate, refused to provide provisions, forcing the emperor's troops to live off plunder in hostile territory. The morale of the army, once bound tightly to Maximinus, began to weaken under these conditions. Soldiers who had followed him for years now wondered if loyalty to a distant, hated emperor was worth starvation and hardship. Rumors of the Senate's promises of amnesty and rewards to defectors spread in the ranks. Meanwhile, the Senate prepared Rome's defenses, raising militias, fortifying the city, and using propaganda to paint Maximinus as a tyrant, a barbarian, and an enemy not only of the Senate but of the Roman people. Statues of him were torn down, and his name was cursed in public. The empire had split. On one side stood the Thracian soldier emperor with his weary legions. On the other, the Senate with its hastily chosen emperors and the support of Italy. When Maximinus reached the northern Italian city of Aquileia, he encountered unexpected resistance. The city, fortified and loyal to the Senate, barred its gates against him. But the defenders fought with desperate courage, hurling stones, arrows, and boiling oil upon the attackers. Maximinus himself, as always, was present at the front, urging his men forward. But the siege dragged on, food grew scarce, disease began to spread in the camp, and morale collapsed further. Of the gods favoring the defenders, and of Maximinus's doom approaching, the Senate, in turn, used this moment to rally greater support, spreading word that the tyrant would soon be defeated. The emperor's fate was sealed not by battle, but by betrayal. Hungry, exhausted, and demoralized, the soldiers finally turned on him. In 238 CE, in his tent outside Aquileia, Maximinus Thrax was murdered by his own troops. Their heads were sent to Rome as proof of the tyrant's fall, and the Senate rejoiced at the end of the emperor they had long despised. Rather, it marked the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. His violent overthrow set a precedent for emperors to be made and unmade by military revolt. From this point forward, the empire would be plagued by rapid turnovers of rulers, foreign invasions, economic decline, and internal division. Maximinus Thrax, the giant from Thrace who had risen from obscurity to the imperial throne, thus became a symbol of both the strength and fragility of Rome in this period. Men who owed everything to the loyalty of their troops, but who could never escape the hostility of the senatorial elite or the demands of the wider empire. He showed that personal strength and battlefield valor were no longer enough to sustain the empire, for Rome required balance, diplomacy, and legitimacy that went beyond the sword. His downfall at Aquileia demonstrated the limits of brute force and the dangers of ruling by fear and exclusion. The Senate may have celebrated his death. The memory of Maximinus lingered, exaggerated by hostile historians who painted him as a brutal tyrant. Ancient writers emphasized his enormous size, his coarse manners, and his cruelty, contrasting him with the cultured Gordians or the senatorial emperors that followed. They also capture the reality that Maximinus never sought to integrate himself into Rome as traditional elite culture. He was a man of the camps, not the Senate house. His legacy, therefore, became inseparable from the narrative of Rome's decline into the chaos of the 3rd century, the rise of the military, and the increasing fragmentation of imperial authority. In this sense, Maximinus Thrax was both a product of his age and a catalyst for its instability. His short, violent reign illustrated how quickly fortunes could change in the empire, how emperors could rise from obscurity and fall to betrayal, and how the balance of power had shifted irreversibly from Rome as aristocracy to the legions stationed on its frontiers. For modern historians, Maximinus remains a fascinating figure precisely because of these contradictions. Was a capable soldier who defended Rome's borders and embodied the martial values that the empire desperately needed in a time of external threats. On the other hand, his inability to manage civilian politics and his heavy taxation policies sowed the seeds of his downfall. His reign also raises questions about identity in the Roman world. His rise shattered the old barriers that once limited imperial power to the senatorial aristocracy. In this way, Maximinus anticipated the later trend of emperors emerging from the provinces and the military, men who would dominate the 3rd century as Rome's crises deepened. Did not erase his significance, but rather highlighted the precariousness of imperial authority in an age of constant upheaval. Thus, though his reign lasted only 3 years, Maximinus Thrax stands as one of the pivotal emperors of Rome's history, a man whose story reveals both the possibilities and perils of power in the Roman Empire. After the violent death of Maximinus Thrax and his son in 238 CE, the Roman Empire was plunged into chaos, a period marked by political instability, military upheaval, and a profound questioning of imperial authority, which would reverberate throughout the empire for decades to come. While his reign had been brief, spanning just 3 years, its effects were disproportionately significant, for Maximinus had embodied both the possibilities and the perils of the emerging 3rd century model of soldier-emperor rule, a system in which military power became the central criterion for legitimacy, and where the traditional mechanisms of Roman governance, the Senate, civic institutions, and provincial elites were subordinated or ignored entirely. This revealed a fragile equilibrium that could be disrupted with extraordinary ease, as was demonstrated when his strict reliance on army loyalty, combined with his alienation of the Senate and heavy-handed fiscal policies, ultimately sowed the seeds of his downfall. Maximinus, of Thracian origin and humble beginnings, had risen to power not through family lineage, senatorial connections, or traditional Roman political pathways, but through sheer physical strength, personal courage, and an intimate understanding of the soldier's mind. His rise challenged centuries of elite Roman ideology and provoked intense animosity among the aristocracy, who viewed him simultaneously with fear, disdain, and incredulity, as a barbarian outsider who had usurped power by force rather than right. His initial campaigns along the Rhine and Danube were characterized by relentless engagement with Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, campaigns that not only secured the frontiers, but also established his reputation as a hands-on, fearless military commander, often present in the thick of battle, enduring the same hardships as his soldiers, sharing their food, their cold, and their exhaustion, thereby earning a level of loyalty and devotion that few emperors could command. Yet, despite these military achievements, the wider ramifications for the empire's governance were profound. His focus on military affairs came at the expense of civic administration, economic stability, and political diplomacy, leaving the empire's social and political structures under tremendous strain. The financial demands of sustaining such continuous campaigns forced Maximinus to implement increasingly oppressive taxation, confiscating wealth and property from the elite, requisitioning resources from the provinces, and imposing extraordinary levies that fueled resentment among the senatorial class and wealthy landowners. Their traditional roles as patrons and civic benefactors had been systematically undermined, creating a profound disconnect between the emperor and Rome's governing elite, who saw their influence evaporate under the weight of Maximinus as militarized rule and feared for their own positions and lives, given his readiness to execute those perceived as disloyal or insufficiently compliant. While his policies kept the army loyal through generous donatives and promotions, they destabilized the provinces, causing unrest and rebellion, most dramatically in Africa, where local elites revolted against imperial exactions, allying themselves with Gordian I and his son Gordian II, figures who represented the old aristocratic order and whose sudden elevation as emperors signaled an extraordinary challenge to Maximinus' authority. Even after the rapid collapse of the Gordians' rebellion, due to the military superiority of a loyalist governor of Numidia, the episode underscored the vulnerabilities inherent in an empire ruled predominantly through force rather than consensus, legitimacy, and negotiation. The Senate, witnessing these events, seized the opportunity to assert its own authority, appointing Pupienus and Balbinus as joint emperors while elevating the young Gordian III as Caesar, a move designed to placate popular sentiment while consolidating senatorial power. Yet this strategy further inflamed Maximinus' wrath and set the stage for a direct confrontation that would ultimately prove fatal. He mobilized his legions and began the arduous march from the northern frontiers into Italy, a journey that exposed the limits of his military genius, logistical planning, and the durability of army loyalty. The campaign was plagued by supply shortages, harsh terrain, disease, and the growing reluctance of soldiers to engage in combat against fellow Romans, leading to an erosion of discipline and morale that would culminate in his assassination outside the walls of Aquileia. The siege of Aquileia itself became emblematic of the broader failures of Maximinus's approach to governance. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority and the personal courage and determination of the emperor, the city's defenders, fortified and motivated by loyalty to the Senate and the ideals of Roman civic duty, withstood repeated assaults, forcing his troops to endure starvation, exposure, and disease. Propaganda emphasizing his tyrannical nature further undermined morale, leading to a mutiny in which Maximinus and his son were killed, their heads sent to Rome as a grim demonstration of the Senate's renewed authority. Yet their deaths did not solve the empire's deeper structural problems, which now manifested in the rapid succession of emperors, civil unrest, and the persistent threat of external invasion that characterized the crisis of the 3rd century. Maximinus's legacy must be understood both as a cautionary tale and as a reflection of systemic forces reshaping the Roman Empire. A ruler whose personal valor and military skill could not compensate for neglect of political diplomacy, civic engagement, or economic policy, and whose dramatic rise and violent fall underscore the fragility of imperial power, when dependent exclusively on the loyalty of soldiers rather than the consent and cooperation of broader societal institutions. Furthermore, his life and reign illuminate broader questions of identity, legitimacy, and cultural perception within the empire. For his Thracian origins, outsider status, and ascetic, soldierly lifestyle challenged entrenched notions of what it meant to be Roman and to rule Rome, provoking both admiration from the army and fear or hostility from the elite, demonstrating the cultural as well as political dimensions of power in the 3rd century empire. The combination of military necessity, fiscal pressure, and institutional tension that defined Maximinus's rule provides historians with critical insights into the dynamics of loyalty, rebellion, and authority, revealing that personal courage and battlefield prowess, while essential for the security of the empire, were insufficient for maintaining stable governance across Rome's vast territories, and that failure to integrate military success with political legitimacy and social cohesion could have catastrophic consequences. In this context, Maximinus Thrax represents both the possibilities and dangers inherent in the era soldier-emperor model, the capacity for extraordinary achievement, particularly in defending the empire's borders and commanding formidable armies, juxtaposed against the inevitable risks of alienating key social and political institutions, destabilizing provincial economies, and fostering conditions in which rebellion and assassination became not merely possible but probable, illustrating a pivotal transition in Roman history from senatorial-centered governance to militarized rule, and highlighting the fragile balance that defined imperial authority during the early 3rd century. Maximinus's assassination, the subsequent elevation of Popinus, Albinus, and Gordian III, and the ongoing crises of the period collectively illustrate the consequences of neglecting these interconnected dimensions, demonstrating how the pressures of frontier defense, army loyalty, fiscal demands, and institutional antagonism interacted to create a volatile political environment in which emperors could rise and fall with alarming rapidity, leaving an indelible mark on the empire and setting the stage for decades of instability, civil war, and external threat that would define the mid-3rd century Roman experience. The reign of Maximinus Thrax, from his rise from humble origins to his violent death, captures the tensions of an empire caught between tradition and necessity, culture and force, and the expectations of Rome's elite versus the demands of its legions. Part 4 consolidates the lessons of his campaigns, political missteps, and cascading consequences, revealing a portrait of an emperor whose ambition, strength, and determination were both his greatest assets and his ultimate undoing, a figure whose story illuminates the broader crises and transformations that would define Rome for generations to come. The aftermath of Maximinus Thrax's assassination in 238 CE marked one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in Roman imperial history, revealing the fragile nature of power, the shifting balance between military authority and civic legitimacy, and the profound consequences of ruling by force rather than by consensus. The empire, though momentarily freed from his autocratic presence, faced a precarious vacuum, as the mechanisms of succession remained unclear, and the traditional role of the Senate had been both challenged and reinforced in ways that would shape governance for decades. The elevation of Pappinus and Balbinus as joint emperors, alongside the youthful Gordian III as Caesar, was a deliberate attempt by the Senate to stabilize the political environment and counteract the perception of military dominance over civil authority. Yet this arrangement, while innovative, exposed the intrinsic weaknesses of relying on multiple centers of power without clear lines of command or consensus. Pappinus and Balbinus, though competent administrators and seasoned political figures, struggled to assert authority over an empire still divided by regional loyalties. Economic pressures and the lingering influence of the military establishment that had elevated Maximinus in the first place as a member of the Gordian lineage served as a bridge to the senatorial class, but offered little practical experience in leadership. The social context of this period provides insight into the enduring structural vulnerabilities that had been exposed during Maximinus' rule, including the dependence on army loyalty for legitimacy and the corrosive effects of fiscal pressure and heavy taxation. Provinces that had suffered under Maximinus' exactions now faced the challenge of rebuilding economic stability and civic trust, found itself constrained by the very forces it had sought to manipulate: powerful generals, seasoned commanders with personal followings, and legions whose loyalty could be bought or eroded depending on leadership conditions. The broader implications of these events extended beyond Rome itself, affecting the governance and security of the empire on multiple fronts, where local populations had experienced both the oppression of Maximinus' taxation and the tumult of revolt. The recurring theme of rebellion and counter-rebellion during this period underscores the fragility of imperial structures and highlights the challenges faced by any emperor attempting to govern a vast and diverse territory under conditions of economic strain. Maximinus' policies, while intended to secure loyalty and stabilize the empire through centralized military power, particularly for ambitious provincial elites who recognized the opportunity to assert regional authority or to align themselves with symbolic figures like the Gordians, whose heritage represented continuity with traditional Roman values and legitimized opposition to perceived tyranny. The lessons of this period are manifold: the interplay of military necessity and political legitimacy, and the critical importance of maintaining both civilian and soldier morale in ensuring sustainable governance. Maximinus' reliance on coercion, confiscation, and force may have produced short-term compliance among his legions, but it failed to establish a durable system of loyalty capable of withstanding prolonged strain, fatigue, or the appeal of alternative leadership. Furthermore, his focus on military campaigns at the expense of civic administration created a vacuum in which corruption, leaving local populations disillusioned and increasingly willing to support rebellious figures when opportunity arose. The assassination itself was not merely an isolated act of violence, but the culmination of these systemic tensions, where fatigue, disease, famine, and waning morale converged to erode the cohesion of his army, demonstrating that the physical prowess and personal bravery of an emperor could not indefinitely substitute for strategic leadership. The death of Maximinus Thrax also had profound cultural and symbolic consequences, challenging traditional perceptions of nobility, ethnicity, and authority. His Thracian origins, foreign mannerisms, and soldierly lifestyle had alienated the Senate and urban elites, fueling a narrative of barbarian intrusion and tyranny that persisted in contemporary and later historical accounts, shaping the historiography of the period and influencing the collective memory of the empire's mid-3rd century crisis. At the same time, His reign demonstrated that extraordinary capability and charisma could transcend social and cultural barriers, as evidenced by the devotion of his troops, the effectiveness of his campaigns along the northern frontiers, and the temporary consolidation of imperial authority under conditions of extreme pressure. The intricate relationship between military force, political legitimacy, and social perception during this period exemplifies the complex dynamics that defined the crisis of the 3rd century, wherein emperors were often caught between competing demands from the army, the Senate, provincial elites, and the general populace, creating an environment in which survival depended not only on personal skill and courage, but also on the ability to negotiate, manipulate. The implications for future emperors were significant. The need to secure army loyalty and address economic pressures became central considerations in imperial policy. The subsequent administration under Papinus, Albinus, and Gordian III, though momentarily stabilizing, could not fully rectify the structural weaknesses revealed by Maximinus's reign, and the empire continued to experience a rapid turnover of rulers, regional revolts, economic strain. These challenges highlight the broader structural vulnerabilities of the Roman Empire, including the difficulty of governing extensive territories with diverse populations and the complex interplay between central authority and provincial autonomy. Maximinus's life and reign, therefore, serve as both a cautionary tale and a source of historical insight, illustrating how individual leadership decisions, personal ambition, and military prowess intersected with systemic pressures to shape the fate of the empire. The enduring lessons of his rule, including the consequences of alienating traditional institutions, neglecting civic governance, over-reliance on coercive power, and underestimating the importance of legitimacy and popular support, provide a lens through which historians can understand the broader crises and transformations of the 3rd century, including the emergence of soldier emperors, the erosion of senatorial authority, and the increasing volatility of imperial succession. Furthermore, the cultural and symbolic dimensions of his reign, his image as an outsider, the narrative of barbarian intrusion, and the dramatic nature of his rise and fall underscore the significance of perception, propaganda, and historiography in shaping the memory of emperors and their legacies, influencing how subsequent generations understood authority, power, and legitimacy in the Roman world. The consequences of Maximinus Thrax's reign extended beyond immediate political upheaval, as his assassination highlighted the precariousness of relying exclusively on military support, revealed the dangers of alienating key social and political institutions, and underscored the importance of integrating political skill with military competence. The events following his death, including the struggles of his successors, the persistence of civil unrest, and the challenges of maintaining stability across a vast and diverse empire, illustrate the enduring impact of his policies and the structural tensions that defined this period of Roman history. In examining Maximinus Thrax, one observes the complex interplay of ambition, military necessity, economic pressure, institutional conflict, and cultural perception, all of which contributed to the dramatic rise and violent fall of an emperor whose life continues to provide insight into the challenges of leadership, governance, and survival in one of history's most expansive and enduring empires, revealing that the path to power in Rome was fraught with peril. Where success depended on more than personal courage, physical strength, or military skill, and failure could be swift, violent, and transformative, reshaping the course of the empire for generations to come. The story of Maximinus Thrax closes not only with his violent death in 238 CE, but also with the larger legacy of what his brief reign revealed about Rome at the height of its 3rd century crisis. His rise, his rule, and his fall each exposed deep truths about the empire, truths that reverberated long after his body was left lifeless at the gates of Aquileia, and more a reflection of the fragile system that Rome had become, an empire stretched by geography, chosen not by the Senate or the people of Rome. In this sense, his reign reflected a critical shift in the nature of Roman power. Emperors were no longer defined primarily by lineage, but by their capacity to control the army and inspire loyalty in battle-hardened men. He was large, strong, austere, and uncompromising. A man of low birth who dared to wear the purple without the refinement, traditions, or connections expected of an emperor. His relationship with the Senate was poisoned from the start. He did not care for ceremonial gestures, traditional diplomacy, or the theater of imperial rule. He valued military discipline and the security of the borders above all. But this decision to remain with his armies deprived him of the chance to build trust with the senatorial elite, the administrators, and the civic leaders who still controlled wealth, resources, and the cultural legitimacy of Roman power. When financial needs grew dire, Maximinus turned against these same elites and alienating them further. The rebellion in Africa, which erupted under the Gordians, symbolized this widening gulf. Local elites, furious at taxation and imperial confiscations, the Gordians' revolt was short-lived. Rome depended on cooperation between emperor, senate, and provinces. Maximinus, by elevating the army and crushing the others, the Senate's decision to declare him a public enemy and appoint Papinis, Balbinus, and Gordian III marked a turning point. Never before had the Senate so openly challenged an emperor who still commanded legions. This was not simply a matter of politics, but a dramatic rejection of the military-first model of rule. The Senate's gamble was risky, for Maximinus still held the loyalty of hardened frontier soldiers, and his march on Italy was meant to remind Rome of his power. Yet in the end, the strain of long campaigns, the exhaustion of supply lines, and the courage of defenders at Aquileia broke the illusion of invincibility. His own soldiers, starving and disillusioned, turned against him. The siege of Aquileia is perhaps the most striking episode of Maximinus's reign. Here was a city that should have fallen quickly. Instead, its people resisted fiercely. For weeks, Maximinus's troops battered the walls, burning siege engines and enduring hardships for the sake of freedom from tyranny. Disease, famine, and exhaustion spread through the besieging army. Whispers grew louder. Why should Romans starve and die fighting fellow Romans? Loyalty faltered, discipline eroded, and in the end, desperation overcame fear. Soldiers crept into Maximinus' tent and ended his life with the same brutality that had defined his reign. His son was killed beside him, ensuring that no legacy would continue. Their heads, severed and carried to Rome, became trophies of rebellion, proof that even the strongest emperor could be cut down when the delicate bonds of loyalty dissolved. The immediate consequence of his death was relief. For the Senate, it was a victory over tyranny, proof that Rome could still assert itself against military despotism. For the people of Aquileia, it was liberation from starvation. For the legions, it was an act of survival. Yet beneath this relief lay deeper problems that Maximinus had not created, but had made worse. The system of imperial succession was in ruins. The Senate's emperors, Papinis and Balbinus, did not last long, assassinated by their own guards. The young Gordian III would reign, but his authority rested more on symbolism than control. The pattern was clear. Emperors were now vulnerable, at the mercy of their soldiers, their generals, their governors, and the fickle politics of survival. Maximinus' reign thus stands as both a symptom and a catalyst of the crisis of the 3rd century. The years that followed saw dozens of emperors rise and fall, many elevated by troops, many cut down by betrayal. Civil wars, economic collapse, invasions, and plagues ravaged the empire. Maximinus had not caused all these crises, but his rule crystallized their essence. He showed what happened when an emperor relied too heavily on the army, neglected the Senate, alienated elites, and taxed provinces into revolt. He also showed the limits of raw strength and personal valor. For all his courage, for all his endurance on campaign, He could not escape the truth that Rome required more than a soldier. It required a statesman. Yet his story is not only a tragedy, but also a reflection of the adaptability of the Roman system. Rome survived Maximinus, just as it survived countless other emperors who ruled badly, ruled briefly, or ruled violently. His assassination and its aftermath forced the Senate to reassert itself, however briefly. It forced generals and soldiers to consider the risks of loyalty to unpopular rulers. It forced provinces to recognize their own role in shaping imperial politics. In this sense, Maximinus's reign became a lesson, one etched in blood, stone, and memory. His legacy in Roman history remains controversial. Ancient historians, most of them senatorial in sympathy, portrayed him as a monstrous barbarian, emphasizing his enormous size, his rough manners, and his cruelty. They described him as a tyrant who drained the empire for his armies, who despised culture, and who reveled in brutality. Yet such portrayals may also be exaggerations, shaped by political bias. To the soldiers who fought under him, Maximinus was no monster, but a comrade, a man who endured their hardships and led them with courage. His harshness was the harshness of the frontier, where survival demanded strength and discipline. His cruelty may have been no worse than that of other emperors, but his outsider origins made him an easier target for vilification. For modern historians, Maximinus remains a fascinating study in the dynamics of power. His rise shows the openness of the imperial system, in which even a man of humble, non-Roman background could seize power if he commanded loyalty. His reign shows the dangers of imbalance, of prioritizing one constituency over others. His fall shows the fragility of authority when it rests on force alone. The ultimate lesson of Maximinus Thrax may be this: Rome was an empire built on both power and perception. It could endure ambitious soldiers, cruel tyrants, and incompetent rulers, but it could not endure the collapse of legitimacy. When the Senate declared him an enemy, when the provinces rebelled against his taxes, when the people of Aquileia resisted his siege, when his soldiers finally chose survival over loyalty, his legitimacy evaporated. Without it, even the strongest emperor could not survive. In the centuries to come, emperors would face the same challenge, balancing the needs of the army, the Senate, the provinces, and the people. Some would succeed, restoring stability, reforming finances, and reclaiming Rome's glory. Others would fail, dragged down by the same forces that ended Maximinus. But his story endures as a stark reminder of the costs of imbalance. His 3 years on the throne burned brightly, violently, and destructively, leaving scars that Rome would carry for generations. Maximinus Thrax remains, above all, a man who embodied both the promise and peril of the soldier emperor. His strength lifted him to heights unimaginable for someone of his background. His brutality and narrow vision brought him crashing down. In life, he was feared and obeyed. In death, he was remembered as a tyrant. Yet through both, he left a legacy that shaped Rome's 3rd century struggles, reminding us that the empire's fate was tied not only to its armies and emperors, but to the fragile bonds of trust, legitimacy, and cooperation that bound its vast and diverse peoples together.